The year was 1831. The jungles of Cambodia whispered with unease, rivers carrying echoes of armies on the march. To the west, the kingdom of Siam sharpened its blades, determined to tear Cambodia from Vietnamese influence and claim dominion for itself. To the east, the court of Huc stood ready, its mandarins and generals pledging to defend their hold over Cambodia with fire and steel. And in the middle, trapped between two devouring giants, lay Cambodia, a land already weakened by decades of foreign intervention, now destined to become the battlefield of empires. This was not just a war of soldiers, but of survival, where the fate of kings, the cries of peasants, and the ambitions of monarchs collided in firestorms that swept across Phnom Penh, Battambang, and the Mekong Plain. Tonight, we walk into the shadows of that forgotten war, a war that sought to decide Cambodia's master, but only deepened her wounds. Part 1. The March of Shadows. The first decades of the 19th century were an age of turbulence for Southeast Asia. Empires rose and fell, and Cambodia, once the radiant jewel of Angkor, had long since been reduced to a pawn between greater powers. By 1831, the kingdom had become a fragile state, caught between the westward ambitions of Siam and the tightening embrace of Vietnam's Nguyen dynasty. To understand why this war erupted, we must step into the darkness of Cambodian politics, where kings and princes were no longer masters of their own destiny, but bargaining chips on a chessboard stained with blood. Cambodia at this time was divided, its royal house fractured, and its authority eroded. After centuries of decline following the fall of Angkor in 1431, the once proud kingdom found itself sandwiched between rivals. To the west, the kingdom of Siam under King Rama III looked upon Cambodia as a rightful sphere of domination, citing past conquests and the long-standing tradition of Cambodian rulers being forced to send tribute to Ayutthaya and later Bangkok. To the east, Vietnam, now consolidated under Emperor Minh Meng, saw Cambodia as essential to its own security. The Mekong River was not merely a lifeline for Cambodian peasants, it was also a strategic artery connecting trade, resources, and military routes. Whoever controlled Cambodia would possess a gateway into Indochina, and both Siam and Vietnam knew it. The seeds of war were sown in Cambodian succession disputes. Cambodian kings, stripped of absolute authority, often depended on foreign backing to maintain their thrones. Prince Ang Chan, the Cambodian ruler, leaned heavily toward Vietnam for protection against Siamese pressure. For Minh Meng, this was an opportunity to turn Cambodia into a satellite kingdom, reshaping its administration, culture, and even religious institutions in Vietnam's image. The emperor dispatched mandarins and advisors to Phnom Penh, forcing Cambodia's court into adopting Vietnamese titles, dress codes, and rituals. For many Cambodians, this intrusion was humiliating, a reminder that their once great heritage had been reduced to dependency. Yet it was also a bitter necessity, for without Vietnamese backing, Siamese armies would have swept across the plains unchecked. But Siam was not content to watch Cambodia slip further into Vietnam's orbit. Rama III saw Cambodia's submission to Hue as both an insult and a threat. Two Siamese strategists, Cambodia's alignment with Vietnam meant a hostile power pressing against Siam's eastern frontier. Worse still, it symbolized the weakening of Siam's regional prestige. The Siamese elite believed that Ayutthaya's legacy entitled them to dominance over Cambodia, and losing this grip would dishonor their empire. By 1831, tension had boiled over into open conflict. The Siamese mobilization began in the dry season. Armies gathered in Battambang and Surin, mustering elephants, muskets, cannons, and conscripted soldiers from the Lao and Khmer lands, already under Siamese control. The campaign was presented as a liberation, a mission to rescue Cambodia from Vietnamese oppression. But beneath the rhetoric, Siam's true intention was conquest. The generals did not speak of restoring Cambodia's independence. They spoke of placing a pliant Cambodian prince on the throne, one who would rule as Siam's puppet. For Rama III, It was not a matter of Cambodia's freedom, but of Siam's supremacy. In Phnom Penh, word of Siam's advance spread like wildfire. Cambodian villagers whispered of armies crossing the Dangrek Mountains, of elephants shaking the earth with each march. The Cambodian king, Ang Chan, appealed desperately to Hue for help. Emperor Min Meng responded swiftly, dispatching Vietnamese troops into Cambodia to fortify Phnom Penh and the surrounding countryside. What followed was the transformation of Cambodia into a battlefield between two great powers. Its rice fields churned into mud under the boots of thousands of foreign soldiers. By mid-1831, Siamese forces launched their offensives, pushing deep into Cambodian lands. They captured outlying villages, conscripting locals as laborers and forcing others to provide supplies. For ordinary Cambodians, there was no safe side to choose. The Siamese armies treated the population harshly, seeing them as potential collaborators of Vietnam. Vietnamese forces, in turn, distrusted Cambodian villagers, fearing that loyalties might shift under pressure. To be caught between two masters was to invite suspicion, punishment, or death. In this way, Cambodia once again became a victim not simply of foreign armies, but of the geopolitical logic that saw its people as expendable. The Siamese strategy centered on isolating Phnom Penh and breaking Vietnam's hold over the Cambodian royal court. They sought to install Prince Ang Em, a rival claimant to the Cambodian throne, who had long been sheltered in Bangkok. Siamese propaganda portrayed Ang Em as the legitimate ruler, wrongfully denied his crown by Vietnamese meddling. But to Cambodians, the choice was bitter. One prince who bowed to Vietnam, another who bowed to Siam. Independence was a dream deferred, lost beneath the ambitions of neighbors. Vietnam's counter-response was fierce. Emperor Min Meng dispatched his seasoned generals Trong Minh, Giang, and La Van Gisi, ordering them to crush Siam's incursions and reassert Vietnam's control over Cambodia. The Vietnamese army, hardened by years of campaigns against rebels in the south and border wars with Laos, was disciplined and determined. Their soldiers marched through the Mekong Delta into Cambodia, bringing artillery, muskets, and logistical networks that dwarfed Siam's scattered supply lines. Battles raged along the Tonle Sap and the Mekong Basin. Cambodian villagers found themselves consumed in the fighting, their homes burned to deny shelter to enemy forces, their harvests seized to feed hungry armies. For peasants, survival meant fleeing into the forests or swamps, leaving behind everything they had. The Cambodian landscape, already fragile from years of exploitation, now bled under the boots of two foreign titans. By late 1832, the war escalated into a full-scale struggle for Cambodia's heart. Siamese armies pushed toward Phnom Penh, while Vietnamese forces entrenched their defenses, determined to hold the capital. Skirmishes turned into massacres, ambushes into slaughter. The Cambodian population endured looting, forced conscription, and mass displacement. Some villages were wiped out entirely. Their inhabitants marched off as prisoners to Siamese or Vietnamese camps. Each side justified its actions in the name of legitimacy, yet the cost was borne by Cambodians who had no voice in deciding their fate. The Cambodian royal court was paralyzed. Ang Chan, caught in the storm, could do little but cling to Vietnamese support. His authority eroded further as both Siam and Vietnam acted in his name, while his subjects saw only weakness. In many ways, the war was less about Cambodia than about the struggle between Siam and Vietnam for regional dominance. Cambodia was not the prize, it was the battlefield, the body upon which empires carved their ambitions. By 1833, the war had reached a fever pitch. Siamese forces managed to capture significant Cambodian territory, pushing closer to the Mekong, yet their supply lines strained under the weight of extended campaigns. Disease spread among soldiers, provisions dwindled, and morale suffered. Meanwhile, Vietnam's forces gained strength, supported by secure supply routes from the Mekong Delta and the resources of southern Vietnam. Emperor Min, M.A.N., viewed this war not simply as a border dispute, but as a defining moment to cement Vietnam's dominance over Cambodia once and for all. The climax came as Vietnamese counteroffensives drove Siamese armies back. The dream of installing a Siamese-backed ruler in Phnom Penh crumbled under relentless Vietnamese pressure. Villages that had once flown Siamese banners were retaken, often with brutal reprisals. Cambodian peasants, caught between retreating Siamese and advancing Vietnamese, suffered yet again. They were forced to provide food for one side and face punishment from the other. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, fields abandoned. Cambodia's soul was being ground down in the gears of a war not its own. By the close of 1834, the outcome was clear. Vietnam had prevailed. The Siamese armies retreated westward, battered and humiliated. Cambodia, however, did not emerge free. Instead, Emperor Minh Men tightened his grip, officially transforming Cambodia into a vassal of Hue. Vietnamese mandarins and administrators entrenched themselves further in Phnom Penh, effectively reducing Cambodia's sovereignty to a shadow of its former self. Ang Chan remained king in name, but real power lay in the hands of Vietnam. For Cambodians, the war had been a tragedy of impossible choices: align with Siam and risk destruction at Vietnam's hands, align with Vietnam and endure humiliation as their culture was reshaped and their independence eroded. In truth, there had been no path to freedom, only survival beneath the shadows of greater powers. The War of 1831–34 was remembered not as a triumph of one nation over another, but as yet another chapter in Cambodia's long saga of suffering. And so, as the smoke cleared over Phnom Penh and the Mekong flowed silently past villages reduced to ashes, Cambodia's fate was sealed. The kingdom was not liberated, but shackled. Vietnam had won the war, but it was Cambodia that paid the price. Part 2. The Broken Kingdom. The war did not simply pass through Cambodia like a caravan. It settled into the bones of the land and refused to leave. Where Part 1 described the march of armies and the opening of hostilities, this middle chapter records how a functioning polity unstitched itself under pressure, how institutions that once bound a people together began to fray and snap. In the summer and autumn after the first storms of battle, the kingdom most visibly broke, not on a single field, but in 1,000 small places, in dry moats that no longer irrigated rice, in market squares where coin no longer changed hands, in courts that had no authority to enforce even the simplest judgment. The central palace remained a locus of ritual, but the circuits of government tax collection, grain distribution, judicial order, and military levy became contested zones. Officials who left for Baghdad-style briefings or to secure pay did not return. Messengers carried edicts that could not be enforced. The crown, once the pivot of law and religion, became a fragile object whose pronouncements fell like seeds on stone. This is how kingdoms break, not with one calamitous blow, but by attrition, by the slow erosion of capacity, until the state is a memory of its own procedures. Food, always the axis of rural life, became an instrument and an index of collapse. Rice stores were requisitioned first for armies, then for vassals who pretended to be friends, and finally for the administration that could not otherwise command obedience. Villages that had built up surplus in good seasons found themselves stripped in one winter. People who had once cross-planted depended on barter or on the charity of temple kitchens. Famine followed not long after, and famine rewired social relations. Neighbors who had shared rice now bartered in pork, services, even daughters promised as labor to obtain a sack of grain. Refuge flows multiplied. Some fled north to forests and caves, others south toward the Tonle Sap, seeking whatever refuge the backwaters could offer. The visible image of a broken kingdom, therefore, was not only smoke and ruins, but quiet private hunger. The sound of children's bones under thin linen, the hush in a village where mothers paced and calculated the days until the next supply wagon. Authority fractured along lines both old and newly made. The Khmer nobility, long a ladder by which rural elites might climb into courtly favor, split under pressure. Some nobles chose collaboration as the only realistic route to keep their lands and retain the ability, however compromised, to protect their people. They accepted Vietnamese mandarins in their guest halls, married their daughters into Vietnamese households, translated edicts, and taught children Vietnamese phrases, because doing so brought a degree of local autonomy. Others, furious at what they saw as a dishonor to Khmer dignity, turned westward, opening secret channels to Siamese agents who offered military support and promises of reinstated prerogatives. A third group retreated into localism. They refused to take sides, managed essential irrigation repairs, and focused on survival. Each choice came with cost retribution by the other side, suspicion from villagers, a slow moral erosion in which public honor bowed to private necessity. The nobility was no longer a homogeneous class defending a unified kingdom. It became a network of petty sovereignties, each negotiating survival on its own terms. Religiously and culturally, the rupture was subtle and devastating. Buddhism in Cambodia had long been the adhesive of ritual life. Monasteries were places of education, legal arbitration, and sanctuary. As the war sharpened, monks were pressed into unfamiliar roles, storehouse managers, mediators, occasionally recruiters' roles that compromised the side of their vocation that relied on impartial sanctity. Pagodas cut deals with occupiers to protect relics. Some monks collaborated with foreign officials for the grain that kept novices fed. Rituals continued, but the gestures took on a different shape. Processions now carried petitions as much as blessings. Ordination ceremonies counted as lists of eligible sons for levy. Language and law changed too. Vietnamese legal terms crept into Khmer records. Siamese rituals were watched with suspicion, and the cadence of prayers sometimes included small, whispered pleas that were not pious so much as tactical. In other words, the kingdom's cultural heart began to adapt in ways that preserved outward form but hollowed inner meaning. What had been a shared grammar of belonging slowly splintered into dialects of accommodation. Violence changed its face. Large set-piece battle Siamese columns versus Vietnamese battalions were only part of the story. Increasingly, violence assumed administrative forms. Quotas enforced at the point of a spear, re-education detachments that commanded labor brigades, summary executions for alleged collaboration. Bands of desperate men formed insurrections and brigandages, sometimes aligned to a foreign sponsor, sometimes not. Urban centers saw waves of looting followed by reprisals in which suspected collaborators were executed publicly to deter further theft. In the countryside, reprisal cycles were personal and intimate. A village that had sided with one prince might find its wells poisoned or its women taken as hostages to ensure compliance. The psychology of violence changed because its stakes were not always strategic. They were frequently bureaucratic and petty, calculated to ensure the smooth flow of rice or the security of a road. This normalization of small-scale cruelty made the kingdom's breakdown not spectacular but ubiquitous. Cruelty at every checkpoint, every granary, every stretch of river. The judicial and fiscal machinery, the twin pillars of governance, were crippled. Courts could not operate without enforcers to bring the accused before them. Enforcers were either dead, enlisted, or on the wrong payroll. Taxation, already a delicate negotiation in agrarian societies, became predatory. Mandarins and local lords passed responsibilities downward. What could not be collected centrally was demanded locally, and those who failed were punished with confiscation or flogging. Land records fell into confusion, titles disappeared, new ones were forged to serve the victor. Displaced peasants returned months later to find their fields occupied by newcomers who carried writs in another language. These legal discontinuities fed cycles of violence and resentment. One consequence was migration. Those who could walk fled to lands that offered ambiguous shelter, creating patchworks of populations whose loyalties were uncertain and so were easy to conscript or exploit. Yet the kingdom did not collapse into total anarchy. In many places, local governance improvised resilience. Village assemblies, councils of elders, merchants, and monks reconstituted themselves as instruments of daily order, negotiating water rights, mediating disputes, organizing grain sharing networks. These ad hoc institutions were not the palace, but they were governance. They preserved life, not by decrees from the capital, but by the slow, patient work of negotiation. Here lay an important lesson. A state can be broken in its centers, yet sustained at its peripheries. The problem, though, was that these assemblies lacked protection. They could not reliably deter soldiers hungry for rice or governors demanding levies. So the true character of the broken kingdom was paradoxical. Local ingenuity maintained the possibility of survival, even as macro-level power drained away. Human stories multiplied in ways that neither poem nor complaint could fully hold. There were merchants who traded in contraband between the camps, supplying rice to villages in exchange for silver that would later be useless. There were women whose sons were marched off and whose grief converted into quiet political acts, hiding fugitives, forging records, bribing clerks. There were children who learned to measure the mood of a road by the number of flags and the color of a uniform, and who at night rehearsed legends that kept ancestral names alive. Old men who had fought in older wars taught new recruits not how to charge with a spear, but how to evade conscription. Each of these micro-histories comprised the real ledger of loss and adaptation. The broken kingdom was not merely a political diagnosis. It was an accumulation of these displacements, small betrayals, and quiet treaties. International and regional politics fed the fracture like wind on embers. Siamese policy did not simply aim at territorial gain. It aimed to reconfigure loyalties by offering titles, land, and arms to promising factions. Vietnam, in turn, doubled down on administrative integration, installing mandarins, rewriting cadastral records, and settling Vietnamese families in strategic locales. European traders watched, some trading arms for rice, others holding back, calculating risk. The great powers indifferent saw. Their strategic alignments meant that the broken kingdom had few external protectors willing to press for Cambodian autonomy. In the corridors of distant capitals, Cambodia was often a footnote, a region to be stabilized, a buffer to be managed, a market to be kept open. That calculus mattered. When external actors reduce a polity to a variable in balance of power games, the internal work of repairing that polity becomes almost impossible. By the time the war's immediate flames began to die, what remained of Cambodia was a fractured mosaic. The court could still hold a coronation. The pagoda could still chant on festival days. Villagers could still plant rice. But these acts of normalcy were worn thin, practiced with the knowledge that someone else might, at any time, decide otherwise. The broken kingdom had learned new arts, the art of postponement, the art of ambiguous allegiance, the art of survival through minimal compliance. These were not noble arts, but they were effective. They became the grammar for a people forced into endurance. The transition into vassalage, then, was not a single treaty but the accumulation of these measures: legal erosion, economic hardship, cultural compromise, and adapted survival. Cambodia had not been conquered so much as worn down into a space where someone else could assert a different order without overt conquest. The closing image of this broken middle chapter is not a battlefield but a ledger, a temple accounting for rice taken and rice returned, a court recording names of those lost to levy, a village list with scribbled notations of people missing fields, abandoned debts unpaid. These marginal marks are the real chronicle of ruin. They also contain the seeds of recovery, because in the lists and the barter arrangements resides a knowledge of who belongs where, who can be asked to help, who once shared seed with whom. The story does not end here. It moves on into the third act, where the consequences of this fracture, political, cultural, and human, become the bedrock on which vassalage is constructed. But before that edifice is complete, the kingdom lay in splinters and waiting, a nation of small, stubborn lights inside a larger dark Part 3. Ashes of Vassalage. By 1834, Cambodia was no longer the kingdom it once was. What remained was not a sovereign crown but a shadow, torn between Siamese ambition and Vietnamese power. The fields of Cambodia had been trampled, its cities looted, and its kings reduced to mere pawns. The war that had begun as Siam's attempt to push back Vietnamese influence ended in a crushing reality. Cambodia would not rise as an independent kingdom, it would sink deeper into vassalage under the court of Huc. The Cambodian throne, once draped in golden silk, was now shrouded in the ashes of defeat. The fall of a crown, the Siamese invasion, driven by fear of Vietnamese dominance, had tried to prop up rival Cambodian kings favorable to Bangkok, but the Vietnamese forces, disciplined and unyielding, countered with superior logistics and relentless pressure. Fort after fort fell, and one by one, Cambodian nobles who had dreamed of autonomy realized they had only exchanged one master for another. Phnom Penh, once a bustling city of monks and traders, was reduced to a political pawn. The Vietnamese installed administrators, dictated taxes, and demanded tribute. Royal ceremonies, once sacred affirmations of Cambodian independence, were now supervised by foreign hands. The monarchy survived, yes, but it was monarchy in name only. The Khmer king sat on his throne, but his scepter carried no weight. His word was hollow. His crown, once blazing with divine kingship, had become a phantom crown, a land between giants. Cambodia's tragedy lay not only in war but in geography. Wedged between Siam and Vietnam, the kingdom had become the anvil upon which two empires hammered their ambitions. Neither Siam nor Vietnam sought to annihilate Cambodia outright. Instead, they sought to use her, to bend her, to keep her alive but never free. The Cambodian peasants paid the heaviest price. They were conscripted into armies, forced to build fortifications, taxed beyond endurance. Villages starved as rice was seized for war. Temples, those eternal sanctuaries of Khmer identity, were looted or desecrated by foreign troops. The people's spirit bent, but it did not break yet. Even resilience could not undo the chains of vassalage tightening around their kingdom. The ashes of kingship. In the war's aftermath, the Cambodian monarchy wore its dignity like a mask, shiny in appearance but fragile underneath. The king remained seated in his palace, surrounded by rituals and courtiers, but every decision was now shadowed by emissaries from Huc. Vietnam installed a new order of administration. Cambodian officials had to answer to Vietnamese governors. Khmer princes were sent to Huc as hostages, symbols of loyalty, but also prisoners in silk cages. The ancient idea of Devaraja, the god king of Angkor, had now faded into memory. Cambodia's monarch was no longer divine. He was tolerated, a puppet with clipped wings. It was an era of humiliation. Cambodia had not only lost battles, it had lost its ability to decide its own future. The broken people, the ordinary people, however, carried the deepest scars. Survivors of the war spoke of villages burned by both Siamese and Vietnamese armies. Sons were taken as soldiers, daughters were taken as tribute. Farmers who once tended rice fields now dug trenches or carried supplies for armies they did not believe in. Folklore from this period tells of ghosts wandering the countryside, spirits of those who died without burial. Souls caught between worlds, searching for the kingdom that had abandoned them. These ghost stories were not just superstition. They were expressions of grief, of a people who felt forsaken by gods and kings alike. The war had left more than ruins, it had left silence, an emptiness where the sound of freedom once rang. The weight of vassalage. By the end of 1834, Cambodia was, in effect, a Vietnamese protectorate. The Siamese retreat marked not a victory for Cambodia, but merely the victory of one overlord over another. From the court of Huc, officials dictated Cambodia's foreign relations, taxation, and military. For the Khmer people, this was the heaviest weight of all, to see their kingdom exist, but not to see it free. Cambodia was no longer erased, but it was enslaved to the will of others. The crown still sat on the king's head, but beneath it lay the ashes of sovereignty, the phantom crown. And so, Cambodia became a kingdom of shadows, a land where the crown glittered but carried no power, where the throne stood but its voice was muted. The War of 1831 to 1834 had not destroyed Cambodia outright, but it had broken its spine. Siam had failed to drive out Vietnam, Vietnam had secured dominance, and Cambodia endured, but as a ghost of her former self. The phantom crown was now the kingdom's reality, a crown without power, a king without freedom, a nation without sovereignty. The story of the 1831 to 1834 Siamese-Vietnamese war in Cambodia is not simply the tale of battles and politics, it's the story of a kingdom trapped in the jaws of giants, fighting not to win, but to survive. The war ended with Cambodia alive, but shackled, forced to bow to Huck, while glancing fearfully toward Bangkok. The ashes of vassalage became the soil in which future struggles would grow. For Cambodia, independence remained a dream deferred, a flame that flickered but never died. And in that flickering light, one lesson remained clear. Kingdoms may fall, crowns may turn to phantoms, but the memory of freedom never fades. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next Frozen Histories episode.